Metropolitan Transportation Authority. I mean, the staff has gone from one to another. So we've got 100 years of government bureaucracy. I used to work for it, so I can't complain about it, but getting a nice pension. But that's the succession. And they say, we want more. We want subways. Now, you gave the Bronx a subway, and now Queens wanted subways, and Brooklyn wanted subways. And so the Rapid Transit Board is directed to lay out a set of routes, and they do. They lay out 20 new subway routes in 1903 to go to all parts of Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and even to Staten Island. And the cost of this system that they propose is between $300 and $400 million, which the first subway cost about $45 million. So it's really 10 times the amount of money there, or almost 10 times the amount of money they're talking, and it's much more extensive. It's more like 200 miles of subway that they're planning. And everybody says, okay, let's build it, let's go. Nothing gets built, and nothing gets decided on between 1902 and 1913. Now, why is that? Why don't we have a Second Avenue subway now?
Spent a lot of money for other things. They spent the money for other things.
Well, with the Second Avenue subway, they did spend the money for other things, right? But here, there's no, I mean, what they did was they spent the money on the Second Avenue subway on fixing up the existing subway system. Here, you didn't have anything really to fix up anymore. But the question was really where the money was going to come from. Because the first subway was very successful and had many more riders than people thought, and the IRT was actually making a nice profit on its investment in the subway, which was not that big because the city had put up most of the money to build it, and the city owned the IRT subway. But all of the studies that are done by the IRT and another company which by 1900 is running all the elevated lines in Brooklyn, called the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, which later becomes the BMT, or the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Company, all of the studies that are done by their engineers, and then later studies that are done by public sector engineers, come to the conclusion that at a 5-cent fare, these subway lines aren't going to pay for themselves, not to speak of making a profit, for at least 10 or 20 years. So they're high risk. And so the question becomes, who's going to pay? Who's going to put the money up to take the risk? And it's clear that the city doesn't have enough money. The city had about a borrowing capacity, about $200 million in 1910. So it got some money to put up. So you need some private sector money. And the debate goes on and on. I have a whole book that I wrote about this. It's called Tunneling to the Future, if you want to read about it. It's really excruciating detail of how this goes on. But it goes on for 10, 11 years. And finally, in 1913, there's a decision made where the city and the two private companies will join together in a great expansion of the rapid transit system, basically the rapid transit system that we have today. And the catalyst for how that gets done is in part because a lot of the business community in Manhattan wants there to be more room for office space in Manhattan and for factory space. And Midtown Manhattan, which was a residential area, an upscale residential area in 1900, was seen as the next central business district for New York City. So Midtown from 34th Street to 59th Street, from say 3rd Avenue to 8th Avenue, was seen as the next business district. So you had to have subways built there. But even more important in terms of what actually happened was, as I said before, New York's tenement districts were severely overcrowded in 1900 and 1910. And not only were they overcrowded, but they were filled with things that scared middle and upper class people. They had very high crime rates. Jewish women, of all people, were becoming prostitutes on the Lower East Side, which was unheard of. Jewish women weren't supposed to do that. There was a big gambling industry on the Lower East Side. Numbers running was available. And on top of that, there was high levels of every type of contagious disease that was known to humankind, including cholera and typhoid and typhus, and diphtheria especially was a concern. Some of those diseases had vaccines developed for them by 1910, but there was one disease that was very frightening that did not have a vaccine and could not be cured, which was tuberculosis. And every block on the Lower East Side in 1910 had some cases of tuberculosis. There were big exhibits that were done. And it's really that fear of tuberculosis within the community. I mean, 70% of the people in New York are living in tenement buildings in 1910. And it's not just that it will also that will spread to the rest of the city. And then it was also unclear exactly how tuberculosis spread. It spreads by breathing on people. So people in sweatshops that worked in close quarters breathed on each other, and they got it. But there was also a fear that you could breathe on clothing that was made in the sweatshops that was shipped out to places like Kansas. And somebody, the little old lady in Kansas that bought a dress that was made in New York would get tuberculosis. There was actually novels written about things like this. So things are going on. There's a big battle about how to build the subway. And out of that battle, it actually becomes, it's actually the hottest political issue. It's hard to believe. And what's hard for all of us to believe, actually, is this is a pre-automobile era. The automobile is not seen as a way of commuting until the 1920s in the United States. So if you want to have some people get back and forth and spread out the population, you have to do it by rapid transit. And the fact that the Rapid Transit Board isn't able to do things means that the 1906 gubernatorial election is caught up in this issue. And the gubernatorial election is actually won by a guy named Charles Evans Hughes, who's a Republican, but he's a Republican, he's an ally of Theodore Roosevelt, who's the president at the time. He's a progressive Republican. And Hughes was sort of a reformer who believed if you put the facts on things, you could decide what to do. And the reformers in New York, headed by the City Club of New York, had formed something called the Congestion Exhibit at the Museum of Natural History, where they showed how bad conditions were in places like the Lower East Side, and also proposed solutions to it. And a lot of people had come to the conclusion by 1910 that you couldn't solve the problems of the slums by alleviating things within the slums. That is to say, building better schools wasn't going to help, and setting up settlement houses, which had been done from the 1890s on, wasn't going to help. You really had to allow the population to spread out from these congested areas. And so Hughes hears a lot of that stuff, and Hughes, who's not an insignificant person, I mean, those of you probably, Hughes is not a common household name now, but Charles Evans Hughes ran against Woodrow Wilson for president in 1916. We're talking here 1907, 1908. And he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the 1930s. So he's a major figure in American history. And Hughes comes to this congestion show at the Museum of Natural History. And he says that the exhibits he saw at this congestion show were the most instructive commentary upon the conditions in the city of New York that I have ever seen. He had come away, quote, feeling oppressed and depressed by the facts that are here or there made so clear, and the models that are so eloquent of the wretchedness and misery which are incident to our progress. Hughes commented that it was a common view that many people were bound to be unfortunate, and that it was easy to, quote, shrug our shoulders and go about our own business as though it did not concern us. But this was not the way to look at it. The governor then noted, who pays the bills? The city and the state are paying for the crime, for the disease, for the wretchedness that comes from these congested conditions. No man, however he might pride himself upon his success, can get away from his brethren altogether, and he cannot afford to have plague spots upon the city. This is the governor of New York State. And then he tours the exhibit, and he comes away and he sees that the City Club had put together this thing that showed you can build a lot of subway lines at one time. Build many subway lines, 10 times as many subway lines. Because if you build a whole bunch of subway lines at one time to Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx, so much land will be open for development that you won't be able to build it up with apartment houses. You'll have a mix of apartment houses and single and two-family houses, which most of the East Bronx looks the way it does now because of that, and most of Brooklyn and most of Queens. It's really what was planned as the, instead of wall-to-wall masonry, this much less density city. And you couldn't have an automobile suburb with just single-family houses, because that wouldn't support the rapid transit lines, but you could have this mix of density between wall-to-wall Manhattan and like northern Westchester, where you have like these single-family houses on 2-acre lots. The Bronx and Queens and Brooklyn are somewhere in between. I call them subway suburbs, actually, because what happens is Hughes creates a new commission called the Public Service Commission, which takes over from the Rapid Transit Board. And they work with the city's government to put together this massive plan in 1913, where the IRT will help pay for expanding its system. So instead of just having this crazy line that goes up the east side and then goes over to the west side on what's now the shuttle tracks and goes up the west side, they'll have one trunk line on the east side of Manhattan, which is now the Lexington Avenue line, and one trunk line on the west side of Manhattan, now the Broadway 7th Avenue line. And a whole bunch of new feeder lines from the Bronx and Brooklyn will feed into those trunk lines and will be allowed to distribute the population from the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens throughout Manhattan. And in addition, because the Brooklyn system was run by this Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, they would take all the elevated lines and a whole bunch of new lines, which up until that time either terminated in downtown Brooklyn or came across the Brooklyn Bridge and terminated across the street to City Hall. And they would build a new trunk line for that Brooklyn system that would go up Broadway. So the Broadway line in Manhattan, which is now the Q and the N and the R and a whole bunch of letters, became the trunk line for all of the feeder lines from Brooklyn and was distributed from lower Manhattan, from the Manhattan Bridge and the tunnel from Brooklyn, all the way through lower Manhattan and all the way through Midtown Manhattan and then out into Queens. And that would allow the construction, and the city and the private companies would both contribute to this. The catcher was that the private companies were guaranteed out of the fare box to get their profits ahead of the city and any money that the city would get to pay off its bonds, and that was why this whole plan was very controversial. But according to the reformers who were planning this, who some people claimed were sellouts, there was as I said, this was a big political issue. There was a newspaper publisher in New York at the time who was the subject of a famous movie called Citizen Kane, right? And he was William Randolph Hearst. Now, William Randolph Hearst by the 1930s, like Charles Evans Hughes, has become quite conservative. But in 1910, he was the owner of the two largest newspapers in New York. One was a morning paper and one was an evening paper called the Journal and the American. And Hearst lambasted the public sector guys who put together this plan as sellouts to the private companies. Hearst's idea was that you should build a city-owned and city-operated system independent of these corrupt private companies. Now, the fact that the city didn't have the money to do it was sort of glossed over. Hearst papers were, as far as I can tell, something like the New York Post of the time, but a little bit worse. They really were out to sell newspapers because that was the media at the time. Hearst was getting very rich on his newspapers. They were his major investments. He made a name by attacking the public sector guys and the private companies for this deal that's put together in 1913. And maybe he was right and maybe he was wrong. I personally think he was wrong because what happened was, 100 years later, nobody knows about William Randolph Hearst and nobody knows about his plans, but this spaghetti net of elevator and subway lines on page 2, which vastly expanded the subway system, it tripled the capacity of the system, allowed the subway system to go from carrying 700 million riders a year to 2 billion riders a year, and allowed for the development of large areas of Brooklyn and Queens and Manhattan. You can see the whole subway system covers most of the city except for the outer parts of Queens, and never got to Staten Island because of the problems of digging a tunnel under the Narrows. But there was a plan to extend the 4th Avenue line in Brooklyn to Staten Island. And all of these lines are financed and, most importantly, are built. And they're all opened by around 1920, 1921, 1922. And why that's important is that as they're built, what happens? Ridership goes up. It goes exactly as planned to 2 billion riders a year by 1930. So it's a plan that actually worked. And moreover, if you look at Table 3, which is on page 5, all of the net population growth in New York City is in the areas open for development by these dual system lines. Places like Fordham, where we are right now, and Kingsbridge, and the whole East Bronx, and large parts of Queens, and places like Flatbush and Bensonhurst and Bay Ridge and Coney Island and Brooklyn. They're all built up along these dual system lines. And the net population growth of 2.6 million people between 1910 and 1950 is all in those new subway suburbs. Marion Casey, who's a historian of Irish America, points out that an Irish family living in Hell's Kitchen on the west side of Manhattan, for the same rent that they were paying for a crummy 3-room tenement building on, say, 47th Street and 10th Avenue, could move to Fordham and rent a room apartment for the same rent. She says the only time in history that she knows where people could move up the social ladder without having to increase their income. All they had to do was commit to traveling back and forth to Manhattan on the subway every day, and they could do that on the number 4 train. So while that's going on, places like the Lower East Side, if you look at the table, they lose about 2/3 of their population. So the Lower East Side is now a popular place. It's now if you're hip and you're with it, now you want to dress all in black and you want to go to bars on the Lower East Side because they've taken the old tenement buildings and they've made nice apartments out of them. But the main thing is that the Lower East Side has 1/3 the population. It had, the count here is, that's by one definition of Lower East Side, 400,000 people in 1910, 150,000 people in 1940. And it has about that, at best, even less now. So even though the Lower East Side is still pretty dense, it's a lot less dense than it was 100 years ago. So the main point that you could make is that nobody remembers 100 years later actually how things were financed. The main thing is, did things get built? And all of these subway lines were built, and more importantly, they did what they were expected to do. They allowed people to move like places like Fordham, which, that's how I got to the Bronx. My family was living in a tenement building on 30th Street and 2nd Avenue, and they moved up to be supers in an apartment house on Decatur Avenue in 1920, right along those dual system lines. And then we ended up moving to this apartment house in 1940, actually right on the corner. And you know, all my anecdotal evidence is that compared to places like the Lower East Side, and this is what almost everybody who moves here says, it was a much better place to live than crowded parts of Manhattan. Well, as I say, all those lines are built. There's a lot of controversy over them, and the main thing is that the contracts fixed the fare for the 50-year life of the contracts with the company at 5 cents, because there's no inflation before World War I. So people don't expect prices to go. In fact, there was a deflation from the 1890s to World War I. So the company signed the contracts. Well, what happens, World War I comes along in 1914 and doubles the price of the operating costs and triples the price of the capital costs. And even though the subway lines open, at a 5-cent fare, the companies can't make it, so the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company goes bankrupt in 1918 and comes out of bankruptcy in 1923 as the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Company, or BMT. The IRT is able to survive until 1932, but it goes bankrupt then and stays bankrupt until 1940. Even though they're operating the systems, they're not making a lot of money on it, and so the 5-cent fare becomes an issue. And in the meanwhile, Hearst is still doing his thing, and he gets a mayor elected in 1917. Some of you may have a better opinion of him, but John F. Highland was a mayor who was elected basically with Hearst's support. He had opposed the dual system contracts because they didn't put new subway lines in his district of Brooklyn. Anyway, Highland made the subway a political issue in New York. The 5-cent fare, the fare became a hot political issue in the 1917 and 1921 elections, and Highland said the fare shouldn't be raised, and any new subway line that should be built should be independent of the city-owned but privately operated lines that were built by 1920. So he said, on top of the existing network of subway and elevator lines, we'll put a new system of subway lines that will have no connection with the IRT or the BMT lines, even though they're city-owned. And he gets this approved in 1924, and miraculously, the independent system is built. It opens between 1932 and 1940. The independent system is largely designed not to spread the population out, but to replace the older elevated lines. So that the 6th Avenue subway replaced the 6th Avenue L, and the 8th Avenue subway replaced the 9th Avenue L, and the Fulton Street subway in Brooklyn replaced the Fulton Street elevator line in Brooklyn. And there was a second stage of the independent system in 1929, which everybody thought would be built, and so, which planned for a 2nd Avenue subway and new lines in the Bronx. And we'll get to that in a minute, but the mistake that was made was they started tearing down those elevated lines before they ever finished building the 2nd Avenue subway. So they didn't make that mistake with the 9th Avenue and the 6th Avenue else. So what happened was, from the 1940s on, that they tore down the 2nd and 3rd Avenue L's, but they never replaced it with a 2nd Avenue subway, which is why the Lexington Avenue line, which carried about the same amount of traffic, that's the number of passengers as the Second and Third Avenue L's, became severely overcrowded. And the Second Avenue subway still now in 2007, planned in 1929, has still not been built. Because what happens is all these independent lines are open, and the independent lines further cause financial difficulties for the private companies. So the private companies are all going bankrupt. And when private things go bankrupt in the United States, just like when the private sector doesn't want to do something, what happens if the private sector goes bankrupt? The government takes over, right? So in 1940, the city of New York, under the Board of Transportation, which had planned the independent system, bought out the operating rights of the IRT and the BMT, and so from 1940 on, the whole subway system has been operated as a unity under something called unification by a government agency, which is not a city agency now, it's actually a state agency, but we'll get to that in a minute. And as a result of that, there have been some connections made between the old independent system and the IRT and the BMT lines. Like at 59th Street in Columbus Circle, you can actually transfer. But it looks like a planner was crazy who designed it. Well, because it was never intended to be a transfer. And at 34th Street, there's a transfer. But it's crazy. Like, why do you have to go through these corridors to do the transfer? And there's no transfer available, even now, although the TA is planning it, between any of the IND lines and the IRT or the BMT lines in downtown Brooklyn. So if you look in downtown Brooklyn, there's not one transfer connection between the IND and the, even though they all go to downtown Brooklyn. So Highland, I don't particularly care for Highland. I like the quote that Jimmy Walker defeated John F. Highland in a primary election in 1925. Now, Jimmy Walker is not the greatest mayor we ever had either. But the comment he made about Mayor Highland is wonderful. Because Highland, when he left the mayoralty, became a judge at the Children's Court. And Walker said about Highland, well, finally he's among his peers. So, because Walker and Highland did not get along with each other. And in fact, Highland had been fighting with Al Smith, who was a very close, Smith was the guy behind Walker's election in 25, actually. Anyway, the point is, all of the city subway system, almost all of it, was built under all of these plans that are done by 1940. But then you start having the financial problems. It's clear that at a 5-cent fare, you can't even cover the cost of operation of the subway system, not to speak of its capital costs. And that problem has never been resolved, because if you're saying that the fare shouldn't pay for the full cost of the subway, and yet you're saying you want the subway to be in good condition, and you want new lines to be built, if the public isn't going to pay for them out of the fare, it has to come from subsidies from somewhere, from the city, the state, or the federal government. What happened with the fare is that finally by 1948, the city realizes that the fare has to go up, so it's raised from 5 cents to a dime. But by the early 50s, it's clear that even that's not enough. So there's a new agency created called the New York City Transit Authority, which despite its name is a state agency created by the state of New York. And it's created basically to insulate city politicians from raising the fare, because the board of directors of the Transit Authority can raise the fare by itself without asking anybody. And the idea was that the fare would be raised to 15 cents, which required a subway token to be invented, because up until that time you could put a nickel or a dime in the fare box. And of course it became a hot political issue when Mayor Robert Wagner, ran for election in 1953. One of his main slogans was, "New York needs more than a token mayor." So right away the fare became a hot issue. But that was the whole thing. I mean, he could do that because he knew he wasn't going to be responsible for raising the fare. And the idea was that the capital costs would come from the city government. In fact, under New York state law, the city of New York was responsible for all the capital improvements on the subway system in New York, because the city owns the subway system. Now that's been pretty much a joke since the 1960s, because the city has never put up enough money or been willing to put up enough money to keep the system going. Now, you guys aren't going to believe it, but guess how much it costs every year just to keep the subway and bus system in New York going? In capital dollars, not to operate, not to run the trains, not to run the buses, to replace the buses, replace the subway cars, fix up the signal system, replace the track, replace the bus depots, all that stuff.
Billions of dollars.
Yeah. It's $2.5 billion a year. And all of that has to come from some government subsidy of one form or another. Either the federal government, which gives about $800 million a year, the state of New York, or somebody else. We'll get to that in a minute. So the city wasn't willing to put up a lot of money. Second Avenue subway is approved by the voters in a bond issue, $500 million in 1951. Transit Authority comes along and says, we can't spend the money on the Second Avenue subway. We have to keep the existing system going. Those old IRT subway cars that are now almost 50 years old and have a useful life of 30 years, they have to be replaced. The signal systems have to be replaced. We got to get the money from somewhere. We'll use the money to fix up the existing system. That's what happened to the bond issue money in the 1950s. And that's the story that's gone on ever since, because, and the city wasn't willing to put up the money. And then, of course, in the 1960s, you had a governor who thought he was a big guy, and he was Nelson Rockefeller, right. He was elected in 1959. And so he starts seeing the subway system and the bus system in New York, and most of the bus system in New York is taken over by the Transit Authority in the 40s and 50s and becomes a city operation. And the last one, the Fifth Avenue Coastline, that was done in 1962, but it was by the early 60s, mostly a city operation. The last big addition was the private companies that remained, that were taken over just now, last year. Rockefeller says, well, you know, we got this problem with the subway system, and he really did believe in public transit, and he had a guy named William Ronan, who was his secretary in Albany, secretary in Albany means the guy who's really running the government in Albany. Whoever Spitzer's secretary is, he or she is really running the government. But Ronan was interested in public transit and wanted to really start diverting money more from highways to public transit. And so Ronan is asked by Rockefeller in 1965 how to bail out the Long Island Railroad, which was going bankrupt, well, which was owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad and which had very poor service. So Ronan decides to create something called the Metropolitan Commuter Transportation Authority, but he's really empire building. And in 1968, he gets something created called the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. And that's a regional authority created by the state, most of whose people are appointed by the governor, i.e. Nelson Rockefeller, which means that Bill Ronan, who will be the first chairman of the MTA, will have a lot of power. And the way the thing will work was the board of directors of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority will be the board of directors of the Long Island Railroad. And there'll be the board of directors of the New York City Transit Authority. And there'll be the board of directors of what becomes Metro-North Commuter Railroad. And now all these are lost leaders. They all have to be subsidized in one way or another. Where can we get money? Well, we can raise the fares, and the fares have been raised. But the fare really, in real dollars, is pretty much, hasn't really gone much beyond inflation since it was 5 cents, actually, back in 1908 or 1913. What's the transportation agency that makes money? The Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, which Robert Moses had created. Well, Robert Moses and Nelson Rockefeller, as you can imagine, didn't get along with each other. And Robert Moses' power was taken away when when his agency, the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, which had built the Triborough Bridge and later the Whitestone Bridge and then the Frog's Neck Bridge, and finally the Verrazano Bridge, and the Midtown Tunnel, and the Henry Hudson Bridge, and a few other things, all of which were making money from their tolls. And Rockefeller said, or Bill Ronan said, well, we can take the money and we could use it to subsidize the commuter railroads and the subway system. And that's actually been done because the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority became part of the MTA, which it still is today. And one of the reasons the toll on the Triborough Bridge is $4.50 is because the money, it costs about $1.50 to keep the bridge going. The other $3 is going to subsidize the subway and the commuter rail system and the bus system in New York City. That was one way of getting money. That was a cash cow and was seen as a cash cow that would fund these subsidy operations. And Ronan also got the state to commit to providing operating